historical narrative. Properly speaking, oppressed can, so actually I'm going to write this down because it's actually a very key distinction. So members of the oppressed class, oppressed do have, right, they do have, and this is going to factor, actually this is a good point, right, because it's going to factor into later discussions of Spivak when she really gets complicated in her analysis of Marx, right? But oppressed do have, they do have access to the historical, revisionist history. They do have access to revisionist history. I do. Black people have been oppressed. They have consolidated their power through economic boycott, through civil rights protests and others and so on, to force the orthodoxy, those in control of hegemonic power, to recognize, if you will, their role. Now, granted, this recognition is done half-heartedly, and it's only done because we recognize that they have economic power or whatever it might be. Nevertheless, there is a sense in which that power is used to make sure that there is a Black History Month, that we are included, that there's a Spanish History Month, that there are reparations for Japanese Americans, and so on, right? So that there is a sense in which, and I've given a lecture on all of this before, and not even a sense in which it is true that the oppressed, if their efforts are properly structured, can revise the historical narrative, right? So that we can have heterodox revisionist history, or in opposition to, or in addition to, the orthodox revisionist history. The subaltern is different, right? Because not only are they oppressed, but there's another more latent form of oppression in this notion of subalternity. And for the subaltern, and we'll see this later in a really good quote that she picked out from Marx. For the subaltern, instead of do have, they do not have. Right? Properly speaking, the subaltern, and I don't know that anybody's made this distinction in the way that I'm doing it now, but the whole point of me doing this is, I could be writing tons and tons of paper to try and get stuff out to the world and blah, blah, blah. But, I'd rather just give a lecture, because then everybody gets smarter. All right. So the subaltern do not have access, right, to revisionist histories. So you can think of subaltern oppression, if we're talking about oppression as an umbrella, and we have varying degrees of oppression, then it would be the case that subaltern oppression is a more severe form of oppression than just your standard ordinary oppression, right? Which is not to minimize the significance of oppression in any sense, but subaltern oppression is so oppressive, their state of existence is so oppressive, that there isn't even an attempt to make contributions to a revisionist history. There's nothing that's said, right? There's nothing that's said in that subaltern oppression. This state of affairs can change in the future, and they can elevate their status from a subaltern oppressed to just a typical oppressed, right? But when there isn't even a recognition that these forms of oppression are happening, well, it's properly speaking subaltern, right? So there is a big distinction between oppressed and subaltern oppressed, and I think far too frequently people are like, oh, well, our community's subaltern, our community's subaltern. But the very fact that you're saying our community's subaltern, and obviously the intent in saying our community is subaltern is to bring attention to sort of the transformation. Well, you've entered this revisionist history. You're trying to allow the external forces, those in control of hegemonized power, to recognize your quote-unquote subalternity, which really what you're trying to say is, hey, we're oppressed. Real subalternity doesn't even have the conduit in which there is the means of recognition. So this goes into subjectivity and so on, which is where the discourse is going. But as I said, Spivak's paper is a no-holds-barred, rigorous theoretical super airtight, as far as I'm concerned, account, and you really got to know what's going on for any of this to make sense. So look, don't equivocate, like we were saying with equivocation. Obviously, two different words, but subaltern and oppressed are not interchangeable, right? They're not interchangeable terms. The subaltern are oppressed, so you can make the following claim too, right? All subaltern are, and I actually write it down, right? Just to even take it even further, right? So all subaltern are oppressed, right? All subaltern are, this will take everything that I just said and consolidate it into a nice little soundbite. Okay? So all subaltern are oppressed, but not all oppressed, ED, if I could write, are subaltern. So if you want to make the distinction, typically graduate students have a difficult time understanding the distinction between subalternity and oppression. Keeping this in your mind as a nice little soundbite, it's easy to remember, will ensure, as far as I'm concerned, that you don't make problems of sort of significance of equivocation between the terms subaltern and oppressed. Why? Because every single subaltern is oppressed. Subalternity is a form of oppression. It's a very sort of manifest, deep form of oppression. I believe there's a deeper form, but I'm not going to get into that now. There is a form of oppression in which individuals are subaltern. So all subaltern are oppressed. However, you do have those who are oppressed who are not subaltern. Who, for example, individuals who are oppressed that have access to revisionist histories. Your accessibility to revisionist histories means that there is a sense in which the hegemonic power, though they're still keeping you in your place, quote unquote, recognize that there has to be an interchange, there has to be sort of the pacification of the Negro. Listen, we don't really want to listen to these black guys, but they got a lot of money now, they got a lot of influence now, so let's pacify them so that they get what they want and they leave us alone, right? That attempt to even pacify is a recognition, right, of many things, including my subjectivity, but it's a recognition. Subaltern lack that recognition. Therefore, all subaltern are oppressed, but not all oppressed are subaltern. So, again, this isn't even really, properly speaking, Spivak's paper. These are the concepts you need to know in order to understand Spivak's paper, right? Because she's very, very meticulous in her word selection, and to conflate oppression with subalternity would be completely do disservice to her research. She would not agree with, at least my interpretation of her piece is that she would not agree that the two are the same, for specifically this reason. Alright, so number 4, I guess I can write it here. Number 4, the subject and subjectivity, right? There is a distinction between subjectivity and the subject, right? And we have to make sure that we have an understanding of what it is that the subject is, right? What does it mean to be a subject? I'm actually going to do a full-blown sort of, several-hour lecture sometime in the future, maybe before the end of this year, on sort of the I, right? On subjectivity and sort of tracking the subject historically through the philosophy of ideas. Right, because subjectivity has changed and is still changing, right? I think usually if you've done a little bit of philosophy and you've read a little bit and you have a slight understanding, then you know it was sort of raised to the forefront in sort of this notion of Cartesian dualism, which I've lectured on before, right? So that the subject becomes problematic because there's this schism, there's this split within the individual, right? There is the part of me that is idyllic. There's the part of me that is materialistic. How do I relate the mind me with the stuff me, and so on? That discourse is now antiquated and probably defunct, but that is not just the discourse. That alone is just one small, tiny aspect of subjectivity within the philosophical tradition, not the psychoanalytic or psychological tradition. Within the philosophical tradition, we have our own discourse on subjectivity. And it's important that you understand not necessarily the totality of the discourse on subjectivity, because that's an enormous body of